I usually begin by telling you a little bit about the store and how we think of ourselves as something of a community center with book groups that meet downstairs most nights of the week and a wide range of classes and trips. But instead, this afternoon, I can tell you about Phyllis Theroux because she is, in fact, a very critical part of what we do here at the store by way of programming. She teaches a staple class here called the Journal Keeper, and it's so popular that when we open it for sign-up, it's kind of like managing tickets for a U2 concert. The phones start ringing, and it usually sells out right away. We've, in fact, started offering 2 at a time, and those sell out as well. She's also going to lead a trip for us to Tuscany in the fall, a writing retreat. If that's of any interest, let me know and come ask Phyllis about it after the event, or ask me, or take a look at our website. She's also, a part of the store in other ways, a longtime friend of the original founders, Carla Cohn and Barbara Mead. She's an essayist, columnist, and author of books including California and Other States of Grace, and the Book of Eulogies, and the Journal Keeper, which is a perennial here at the store. She's here today to discuss her new book, The Good Bishop, which is about the recently deceased Walter F. Sullivan, who held the office of Bishop of the Richmond diocese for 29 years. The result is an inspiring portrait of a man who brought a human touch to his role and who struggled faithfully to lead the church with integrity, compassion, and love. Please help me welcome Phyllis Theroux.
I didn't tell you this, Susan, but I think when my time comes to meet my maker, I'm going to have my funeral here. Really, it feels so much like the place where all paths have kind of intersected over my life. And I don't know how many of you are here because you just can't wait to hear about a Catholic bishop. Would all of you raise your hand who are in that category? Okay, at least 3. It was not something I set out to do, to write a biography of anybody, much less a Catholic bishop. But it's the weirdest thing. I got a phone call 3 years ago, almost exactly, 2002, in May of 2011, from an Episcopal minister retired in Richmond, asking me if I'd be interested in doing an oral history of his friend Walter Sullivan. Now, I had heard about Walter Sullivan because if you live in the Richmond area, which I have now for over 25 years, you can't not hear about him, even though he's now deceased, but recently. He was a real firebrand in an extremely conservative part of the world. And also, I didn't know this until I started writing the book, but he was a peace bishop in the most heavily militarized piece of real estate in the United States. So, that's kind of getting ahead of it myself a little bit. But I agreed to do it, and I thought, oh, this will be 3 or 4 months. Great. I quoted a price, and I said, if we get along, this is wonderful. So I went down to Aunt Sarah's Pancake Palace on Broad Street. This is all in the book, so I don't want to go on about it too long. And the pancakes hadn't even arrived before I knew that I would be happy to do an oral history of this man if he would be happy to have me. But after I got going on it, I realized this is not an oral history. This man had a huge life. And so I thought, I'm going to have to scrap that approach, because an oral history, if you've ever had one done or done one yourself, is sort of like the nave of a cathedral. Most of it is taken up by the person, him or herself. And then if you interview friends or family, siblings, those are kind of like flying buttresses that kind of support the main story. But this is no cathedral. I said his life was more like the Denver airport. I mean, it just went everywhere. And the other thing that really is kind of interesting to me is that not only did I have no idea that in my life I would be doing a biography of a Catholic bishop, but I never realized that how our paths had intersected so many ways in my life and his. Just to give you an example, he was born not too far from here on Chevy Chase Parkway. He's the youngest or the third of 4 children to a very devout Catholic mother, and of course father. But the father sort of took off early, and so she basically raised the children on her own. Then, as now, It's still a very heavily Catholic neighborhood. Maybe not as Catholic as it was, but he was discriminated against. All those children were growing up. His sister Betty was told that they were all told that they couldn't wear white at their own weddings because their mother was divorced. Their parents were divorced. Now, hop 35, 40 years ahead, and I got divorced in that same neighborhood with 3 children, and I felt that same kind of cloak of coolness get wrapped around me when it became known that I now came from a broken Christian home, as they say. That was just sort of an interesting little intersection. Both of us are pre-Vatican II Catholics. I'm a Catholic convert who's now sort of fallen back into the Episcopal Church, but which most Catholics tend to do at one point or another in their life. He, of course, was a cradle, what they call a cradle Catholic. But we were sort of nurtured in the same waters. We spoke each other's language. I knew when he talked what he was talking about, and he knew when I talked what I was talking about. So it was a good match in that way. Finally, there were people in his life that were also in mine. For instance, I don't know if any of you heard of Richard McSorley, Dick McSorley. He was a very radical Jesuit priest. Well, Dick McSorley in my life was somebody who used to come for dinner parties and sit in his Birkenstocks playing radical peace songs in the corner while all the rest of my friends were looking way too sort of suit and tied. But that was how I knew him. And in fact, he played such bad guitar that I said, for Christmas, I'm giving you a lesson. Because I can't take it anymore. Coming to my house, with your bad guitar. Of course, little did I know that he was a complete icon in the Catholic peace movement. And down there in Richmond, when he showed up, it was like having one of the Berrigan brothers show up. He was that revered. And to think that I treated him so poorly in my own living room just kind of makes me laugh. Another neighbor, Bill Grider, who probably many of you know, the wonderful writer Bill Grider, William Grider, came down to Richmond to do an interview of Walter Sullivan for Rolling Stone magazine. Now, I'm thinking he's probably the only bishop in the country that ever got profiled by Rolling Stone. And I actually reproduced most of it in the book because there was no way in which I could possibly paraphrase Bill Grider. So these are just kind of little ways in which the two of us had sort of similarities, and it made it a good match. But when I think about the bishop, apart from my role in it, I think there are sort of 3 words that sort of come to mind. One is popes. He had good and bad relationships with popes. Prisoners. He was a tremendously active bishop when it came to visiting prisoners, particularly on death row and in the prison population in Virginia. And then peace. He was, of course, known as a peace bishop, and he got in a lot of trouble for that. In fact, it really hastened his death. So I thought I'd read a few excerpts, and then we might have some questions. What I call the good pope, which was John the 23rd, was the one who, at the very advanced age of 79, almost 80, decided to have a Vatican, what they call the Vatican II conference. What do you call it? And it was, I never expected to laugh so much doing this book, but it has this for a wonderful way in which the Pope very cleverly bypassed the Curia in this way. The way in which the Pope decided to announce the council is significant. On January 25th, 1959, he invited 18 cardinals from the Curia, the chief governing organ of the church, to accompany him to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls to be present for an announcement. It was not considered an important occasion, and some of the Curia declined. While the Pope knelt in prayer, only he knew that the contents of his announcement he was about to make when he got up from his knees had already been released to the media. The Curia had been bypassed. What they heard, wrote London reporter Desmond Fisher, stunned them. The new pope told them he intended to summon an ecumenical council, and would they please give him their views about it. They looked at the pope, first in amazement and then in horror. Pope John remembers the day a little differently. He claimed that while he had expected the cardinals to clap their hands with approval, there was instead a, quote, devout and impressive silence. Later, he embellished the moment further. On the opening day of the Second Vatican Council, he spoke of how the idea came to him and how it was received. It came to us, popes always talk in the plural, in the first instance in a sudden flash of inspiration. The curious response was immediate, he said. It was as though some ray of supernatural light had entered the minds of all present. It was reflected in their faces. It shone from their eyes. In fact, the Curia thought the new Vatican Council was ill-founded, ill-conceived, and unnecessary. And then, interesting things about it I hadn't learned, and that is that there had been one council before Vatican II, Vatican I, of course, in the late 19th century. It had been sort of hijacked by a war, so they had to sort of hurry up. But one thing they managed to do was declare popes infallible in matters of faith and morals, and that was going to come back to bite the popes that came after them. Because, for instance, things you may not want to know, but I'm dying to tell you anyway. When it came to birth control, Paul VI, who came after John the 23rd, had commissioned a group to go and study the whole issue of birth control and come back and tell him what he should do. And they came back and said, they should allow it. You should allow it. It's a good thing. And then he realized if he did, he would be no longer infallible, because they had already, two popes before, in 1931 and one other time, had said it's a mortal sin to use birth control. So he was sort of hoisted on the petard of the doctrine of papal infallibility. And he basically said, no, you can't use it. And they call that particular incident in the Catholic Church's Vietnam. In 1968, I think it was, a lot of priests left, and a lot of Catholic women in particular were demoralized by the Paul VI's statement. He never wrote another encyclical. That was it for him. Sullivan himself was shaped a lot by his own experiences. He went into the seminary and was told, before he went into the major seminary, which is the high school years, that the church, the diocese, would not support him because his parents were divorced. So he was unable to continue his seminary training unless someone stepped forward. Well, someone did step forward. The diocese of Richmond, as he said, I guess they weren't so picky, and they said, we will subsidize your training. Then, twice before he got out of seminary, he was told by the Sulpicians, I can never say it, but it's an order of priests, that they were going to withhold his graduation up. And I said, why? Why did they do that? And he said, I wasn't pious enough. And he said, I never misbehaved, but he said, and I'm a very churchy person, but he said, I'm not a company man. And they must have sensed that early on, because even before he'd been ordained, they knew that there was something a little different about Walter Sullivan. And indeed, there was a lot different about him. So, I thought it might interest you, because how he is mostly known is as a peace bishop in the Catholic Church. There were never a lot of them, but at one point, and particularly in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was going in the opposite direction, trying to sort of amp up the whole sort of war scene, about 50 or 60 priests or bishops altogether were going in the other direction, which was actually what John Paul II, the Pope that Sullivan didn't get along with so well, was for. On an international level, he was on solid ground, but in the Catholic Church in this country, particularly in Richmond, Virginia, he was on very soft soil indeed. So I thought I would read to you how he kind of backed into being a peace bishop. He actually was not, that was not his, how he defined himself or how he even thought of his life, but here's how it began. He was asked to speak before the Knights of Columbus, a big dinner up in Northern Virginia, and there were about 400 knights and their wives that were all waiting. He'd been the chaplain for the Knights of Columbus, and any of you who know about the Knights, my own son is a knight. He's very proud of it. They were basically formed to support the military in this country. So, the weekend before he was scheduled to address the Knights, Bishop Sullivan spent time at his beach cottage turning over various ideas for his talk. Giving talks was part of his job description. If you're a bishop, you have to give a speech everywhere you go. It's expected. People say, let's hear it from the bishop. So I was looking around for something that was non-controversial and decided I would talk about how Jesus is our peace. I mean, nobody could argue with that, right? On the night of the banquet, the bishop got his answer. It was a large banquet with about 400 knights with their wives in attendance. When Sullivan started to talk about Jesus being our peace, the mood in the hall changed dramatically. They got very hyper, he said. I could see it on their faces, and that made me more hyper. So I began to talk about conscientious objectors that I had counseled. And after I finished, all my friends came up to me and demanded to know how I could give such a talk. It was a moment of shock and clarification for Sullivan, who had been unprepared for such instant hostility. When I gave that speech, and others like it after that, I realized the deep hatred of the whole peace movement. Peace was a dirty word. It wasn't the military, but the civilians, like the knights, who were upset by the word. Just to challenge them was unbelievable. They canonized the Vietnam War. Had the story ended there, the bishop may not have returned home much different than when he had left it, but the evening was not yet over. After all the haranguing, he said, a man on the edge of the crowd with a military haircut came up to me. He identified himself as a retired Marine sergeant. I want to thank you, he said. Tomorrow my son is going to Canada, and I had been ready to disown him. Thank you for saving my son for me. That had such an effect upon me, said the bishop, that I began my journey for peace. Well, I call that the baptism into the peace movement, and then he was confirmed when he showed up to speak about nuclear war and the immorality of nuclear weapons in Norfolk, Virginia. But the amazing thing about him is that Sullivan was the most cheerful warrior. He never met a pope he didn't like. He never met an enemy that he didn't think probably would like him in the long run if they just hung out a little longer. And it was that kind of aura that he projected. And for every one person that took offense to him because of his views, 10 others absolutely adored him because, in fact, he's probably the only bishop I've ever run into, at least in my experience, who actually took the gospel seriously. I mean, he really was a follower of Jesus. And I thought I would end, at least the reading part of it, I hope I put it down properly, with something that he said towards the end of his life when he retired. I remember a seminary professor who contended, he wrote, that priests can lose their faith. I dismissed the idea then, but the thought has always haunted me. Yes, faith can diminish and even be lost, so that in ministry we dry up or simply go through the motions or wait for the magic age of retirement. Diminished faith can lead to burnout, discouragement, and personal tragedy. I certainly support all the outside helps to keep us effective in ministry, but when we take away all the trimmings at the heart of what we are all about as priests, there is the truth found in the words which we received when we received the book of the Gospels. The bishop says to us, receive the book of Gospels, whose herald you are now. Believe what you read, teach what you believe, and practice what you teach. That, Bishop Sullivan concluded, is what our priesthood and priestly ministry is all about. Our lives are driven and motivated by the love of Christ. Walter Francis Sullivan's life was about to come to an end. So, too, were the interviews for this biography. On one of our last working afternoons together, as we sat quietly in his living room, all conversation over. I asked him on a whim if he could define the word evangelize. It means to proclaim the gospel, he replied. And does it not also mean to convert? Oh, no, he shot back. That's the role of the Holy Spirit. Your biggest proclamation must be your life. The good bishop did not know it, but he had just given me the right words with which to end this book. Famous last words. Actually, that's not the end, but I thought it was at the time. I wonder whether there are so many things in this book that I came across. I mean, the whole sexual abuse scandal, which he didn't handle particularly well. He was a hugely ecumenical person in the sense of reaching out to other faiths. He scandalized all kinds of people by giving communion to people who weren't Catholic. And I asked him one time, I said, how do you justify that? And he said, the altar rail should not be a battleground. Who knows the state of a person's soul? So he was a large person in a community that perhaps was not quite as large as he was. And so it gave him trouble. It gave him a lot of trouble. But I think, interestingly, with this new pope who may or may not exhibit some Walter Sullivan characteristics, he may be working overtime upstairs, as somebody said. Maybe this new pope is going to bring us back to something that's a little bit more generic, a little bit more gospel-like than some of the popes we've had in the past. So as you can see, I'm not back in the church yet, but it certainly did. The veil that was rather thick between the church and me definitely thinned as I did more and more research for this book, and that was fascinating to sort of see the inner workings of the church, good and bad. It wasn't all bad by any means.
He sounds like a really wonderful man, and one thing I was wondering, which you've kind of fleshed out, is that it sounds like he was really quite effective. But I guess the question I have is, one, do you see any sort of lessons in him that could generalize to, like our politicians, and, ways to sort of break down some of the barriers? And two, was he effective, or, within the Catholic Church, or, did he end and leave as kind of as an outsider?
The answer is yes to all of it.
Great.
He did end and leave as an outsider, but so did Jesus. And the story wasn't over when he died, and I think it's not over for Walter Sullivan either. In that the church basically killed him. I would say his death was hastened by the way the church treated him. There was an investigation that was precipitated by some irate Catholics in the diocese who knew they couldn't actually criticize him on the issue of peace because the Pope was on his side. So they got him on all these little things, like wafers from the communion paten that were stored in margarine jars, and there was a priest here that was saying Mass in Bermuda shorts, and just all these kind of small details. And finally, the Vatican actually did order an investigation, which was very humiliating. And yet Sullivan was Irish and also Dutch, but his Irishness really came out here. He would not let anyone know that there was a thing wrong. He wrote the Pope and said, "Oh, I'm thrilled that you're coming over. I can't wait to show you all the good things that are happening here." But there was another set of letters which are reported in this book that were given to me by one of his close friends, which shows how much he suffered and how they dangled him, in the air and never did bring any investigation to a conclusion. They just never said anything. They sent somebody over, the report was written, and he never heard what the results were. So Sullivan was not as large a figure on the national stage as, say, someone like Tom Gumbledon, who's still very much with us, or I'm trying to think some of the others. There were a couple of others. Weakland was one, and Hunthausen was not. He and Hunthausen were investigated together. But he was definitely a huge example, not just in the church, but outside the church, if anything, one of his great legacies is that he just kept stepping away from the church. He kept bringing Jews and the Protestants and I should say also, he welcomed gays and lesbians into it. He held masses for them. This was a whole new thing. When one of his own priests had AIDS, and he came to him and he said, "What are you going to do with me?" And he said, "Why don't you come live with me?" So he was constantly setting examples like that did not go unremarked upon. And I think that's really, he was a great teacher for all of us. We should all be doing that. It's not just about bishops. It's shocking how the prisons in this country are just ignored. Bishop Sullivan did not ignore them. In fact, there was one thing I wanted to read from that. There's a prisoner to this day. He has a life sentence. As many of you probably know, Coleman McCarthy, who lives here in Washington. He's been working with Coleman on a peace project. And when I wrote to Joe Giratano, who was the prisoner that Sullivan was such a close friend of, this is what he said when he wrote me back. It was a very bad time for me, meaning he was on death row. He was about ready to be executed. I had foregone my appeals. I was mentally ill. I was being force-fed, injected with painful antipsychotic drugs. I was convinced that I was evil and that I deserved to die. Volunteer lawyers were attempting to convince me to appeal my case and were not having much success. Bishop, that's what he always called him, Bishop, late one afternoon, came to the prison unannounced and asked if he could speak to me. Initially, I told the prison officials no. The captain said, "But it's the bishop. You can't refuse to see him." But I refused. Bishop came again the following day. This is all from a letter that he sent me. This time he sent a message. I don't recall the exact words, but it was something to the effect, "I'm not trying to change your mind," and said something about the last rites. I agreed to see him, and he was brought to the basement. We spoke. I asked him if he believed I was committing suicide. One of my lawyers, an Episcopalian, believed I was. Bishop said that he didn't think so, but he'd not really given it much thought. I was looking for ammunition to rebut my lawyer. I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Catholic. You're an Episcopalian. The bishop says I'm not, etc. My first visit with the bishop was not very eventful, but I was a bit impressed. I sensed a genuine kindness in him. He was not pretentious. He made his distaste of the basement known to the guards' death squad, but he did so in a way that preserves the guards' humanity. He had a real sense of humor. Thereafter, every few months, he would return, and whenever he came, he had a hug for all of us. He was always relaxed, funny, never in a hurry to leave, often to the consternation of the local priest or person traveling with him. I went twice to prison with him I take it back, I went once, to his last visit to death row in Jarrett, Virginia, where death row still exists, for Good Friday service. And, I think we're all dying for respect. We're all dying to be honored. And when you saw the bishop come in and just sort of stand quietly, and these prisoners would come up and take his hand like it was a little bird, you just know that he was giving back to them the humanity that was taken away from them every day of their lives. So I'm sort of getting carried away with myself.
Phyllis, I was wondering what has been the reception of your book in the Richmond area? Has it been reviewed in the local press and in the Catholic press?
Well, let's put it this way. When the religious goods bookstore in Richmond called up the Catholic Virginian, which is a diocesan newspaper, to put an ad into the paper for this book, it was declined. I'm really sorry that they didn't go further, because I've always admired Voltaire, and it was my only chance to be in his category of someone who was banned. But subsequently, Fletcher Lowe, the wonderful man who and Peacemaker, who commissioned me to do this book, went and spoke to the editor of the Catholic Virginian, and they agreed that they would put a notice about the book and how it came to be, without any judgment on it. So that was the ground softened a little bit. It's been very well received in the like the National Catholic Reporter, and the reviews quote are still coming in, as they say. Hopefully there will be lots.
Phyllis, hi, thank you.
Hi, Dale.
Hi. You've spoken about the sort of the rigors of the footnotes and the facts in doing something like this, but as someone, I know you through the lens of the journal courses you do, the journal process, I guess, you could describe as getting inside your own head. And this, you're doing a biography of someone who's still alive, getting inside his head. What was the intersection there, and how did you manage that or feel about that?
He was so easy to get into because he was an old shoe. It was not hard at all. I never asked him a question that he didn't give me a very good answer right away. So he was a very open-faced sandwich kind of a person, and what he didn't actually say, I was able to just fill in by virtue of sort of coming from the same kind of background. I mean, this was 1953 is when he became a priest, where I was in grammar school at that time. But still, there were the 8 Beatitudes and the 10 this and the 7 that. I mean, everything was laid out for you. So I understood that part of his background. And he said everything was very ordered and blah, blah. But somehow he managed. In fact, I found a quote that I begin the book with from Carl Jung, The Development of Personality. What is it in the end that induces a man to go his own way and to rise out of unconscious identity with the mass as out of a swathing mist? Not necessity, for necessity comes to many, and they all take refuge in convention. It is what is commonly called a vocation, an irrational factor that destines man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn paths. And that was really Walter Sullivan. And he's just an example for all of us, I think. Still trying to do it. We all are, I guess. So thank you very much.